Welcome to Golden Adventures. Today I will be talking about Mates at Billabong by Mary Grant Bruce. It was published in 1911 by Ward Lock. It was the second of Bruce's novels. It's a significant improvement on the first novel. It has a really coherent structure. It's not episodic. And I think it's interesting that Bruce didn't sell her first novel, Little Bushmaid, until she had also written Mates at Billabong. She sold them together to Ward Lock, and they were being serialised in the magazine where she edited the children's section at the same time. So you could buy both the books before the second, Mates at Billabong, had finished running in serial form. So, interesting. Now, as I said, this book has a much better structure than A Little Bushmaid, and most of the structure consists of her cousin Cecil being horrified at things that they do at Billabong and not understanding things that they do at Billabong and just not fitting in. So the book opens as Nora is knitting some socks, waiting for her father to come home from Kunji, the nearest township. When he arrives, he tells her that her cousin Cecil is coming to visit, which is unfortunate because he doesn't fit in at Billabong. But they are looking forward to the return of Jim, who is coming home from school. Then her father tells Nora that she's going to have to go to school herself, and she's very upset because they've never been parted before. But she puts on her stiff upper lip, and then they go to town the next day and pick up Cecil, who looks down on them all. They do some mustering, and Cecil manages to fall off his horse, and he's quite embarrassed, and he's very envious of Nora's pony. Right, Brownie, they go back. Brownie has a headache, and Nora takes care of her and makes the tea, and Cecil's outraged that a lady would lower herself by working in the kitchen. Jim comes back from school, and as a bonus he brings Wally with him. That's the pattern from now on. Wally always comes home in the holidays. He's always there. He becomes part of the quartet. They go on a picnic and they ride back in a storm, and Cecil leaves them even though Jim is on a not very well trained pony, so they don't know what he's going to do in the storm. Then the Lintons host a workers' dance, and Cecil refuses to dance with anyone other than Nora. He just doesn't understand their free and easy ways in the country. They celebrate Christmas, and then an itinerant hawker called Lal Chunder, he's an Indian door-to-door salesman, I guess you'd say, comes to Billabong, and the maid panics because nobody else is home, and Lal Chunder gets cross because what he really wants is for somebody to bandage his wound because he's hurt himself. And then Nora intervenes, and even though he doesn't speak much English, she manages to sort out what's going on, figure out that he's not actually threatening them, and she bandages up his wound and sends him on his way. Nora... Oh yes, then there's a chapter which I really like. There's a whole chapter just about raising chickens. Nora and Wally just talk about raising chickens because they like them. Then Nora's out and a man tries to mug her, but Lal Chunder, the hawker she'd helped rescue, intervenes and removes him, and he's taken off to the police. So then Cecil takes Nora's pony Bob's without permission. This bit is just awful. And the pony has a fall, can't rise. Cecil beats him. Poor pony can't get up. Jim, Wally and Nora come looking, and they find this. Bob's the pony expires in Nora's arms. Cecil is sent away in disgrace. And then there's worse to come because Mr. Linton is then missing. His horses come back without him. They hunt for him, and they do eventually find him and nurse him back to health. So that is what happens in the book, and as you can... The rescues. Rescue time. Alright, obviously Nora makes sort of breakfast in bed for Brownie, who has a headache, and takes over her duties when Brownie is ill. Nora intervenes and sorts out what's going on with the itinerant hawker and wraps up his hand and helps him out. And then later on she is rescued by him from a mugger, so it's paid back. Jim and Nora find their father and obviously bring him home and nurse him back to health. And I guess you could say there's like an ongoing rescue of Wally, who is an orphan, doesn't have any family, has not very loving, much older brothers who don't really want him around, so he just effectively gets adopted by the Lintons. Some of the nice points about this book, it is full of incredibly detailed descriptions of Australian bush life, and Bruce had visited her grandfather's station frequently, so it's quite authentic and detailed and accurate. For instance, that chapter that I mentioned where Wally and Nora do nothing but talk about difficulties that you encounter when you're raising chickens and poultry in general. It's very funny, and it's obviously based on bitter experiences of stupid things that chickens do to kill themselves. Right. Also, this book has the one real death in the whole series. Nora's pony Bobs dies, and I can't think of any other examples. In the Billabong books, the dead are always returned to life. The missing are always found, with the exception of the death of Bobs. So it had a profound effect on the audience at the time. Bruce got a piece of fan mail from a kid saying that she'd cried so hard her fillings had come out. So that's commitment for you. And also I'd like to say that Cecil is the worst and most vicious adversary that they face until probably the very last books, where they are up against McGill, the ex-boxer. Cecil is the most effective antagonist too, because he is the only one who actually injures them. So well done, Cecil, I guess, for being a villain. I don't think so. Right. Mates at Billabong has chapter headers, which are quotations from different poems. And they're all Australian authors. So I feel that by using this device, Bruce is inserting herself into the stream of Australian literature. The people she cites are Essex Evans, who started writing in the 1890s. He wrote Ode to Commonwealth Day, which is praised by the Prime Minister, Deakin. So that's pretty darn Australian. Henry Lawson, one of the great two bush poets. Banjo Paterson, the other great bush poet. Henry Kendall, who she assumes the reader's familiar with because she just calls him Kendall. I hadn't previously heard of him, but he's an Australian author, poet, known for his tales set in natural environmental settings and his comic poetry. W.H. Ogilvy, who is a Scottish-Australian narrative poet, jackaroo and drover. Mabel Forrest, who was an Australian writer and journalist from Toowoomba. And, of course, Lindsay Gordon, who was an Australian poet, probably the first Australian poet to achieve international recognition. So Bruce has certainly not randomly selected poets. These are all Australian. She's inserting herself into this stream of Australian literature, which at the time had been, I guess, burgeoning since the 1890s. She's making her mark consciously on Australian literature. I went through the text fairly closely and had a look at the references to other literature that Bruce made, and there's quite a few references. But I'll begin by saying, consciously, the text sort of pushes aside engaging with literature as a sort of slightly effete thing. So Cecil likes literature, the others don't on the surface, and yet when you read it, they are actually constantly quoting from various forms of literature, just not the same ones that Cecil likes. So I'll begin by describing Cecil's disastrous Christmas present for Nora. He gives her a book of William Morris poetry, And I'm going to quote from the text here because it's funny and beautiful. It was poetry, and Nora's soul did not incline naturally to poetry unless it were one of Gordon's stirring rhymes or something equally Australian in character. This was quite different. But it had been Cecil's Christmas gift, and it had seemed to Nora that politeness required her to study it. "It's the rummiest stuff," said the bush damsel hopelessly. She turned to the cover, a dainty thing of pale blue and gold. "William Morris? Didn't we have a stockman once called Bill Morris? But I'm pretty certain he never wrote this. The name's the same, though," thought Nora uncertainly. She turned back and read anew painstakingly. "No meat did ever pass my lips. Those days, alas, the sunlight slips. From off the gilded parclose dips, and night comes apace." Well, I'm positive it wasn't our Bill Morris, because I never saw a stockman who was a vegetarian. But what's a parclose? I'll have to ask Cecil. But then he'll think I'm a duffer not to know, and he'll be awfully patronising. But what on earth does it all mean? She closed the book in despair, let her eyelids droop and nodded a little, while the book, in its blue and gold cover, slipped from her knee to the grass. It was much easier to go to sleep than to read William Morris. Now, the little section that that Nora's reading is from Sir Ozana, The Chapel of Lyonesse, 1856, in which Sir Ozana Le Cure Hardy lies sorely wounded in the chancel of the chapel of the mysterious land of Lyonesse, from which King Arthur comes. So it is fairly abstract and consciously literary. However, there are literary references made by all of the other characters. They're just comic and usually Australian ones. So I'll describe those to you. So, on an overt level, Bruce is mocking literary pretensions, especially Cecil, and portraying it as something that's a feat. But when you read the text, there's actually a lot of literary references in Mates at Billabong. And these are used to, I guess, develop the characters and occasionally to progress the plot. So, to give you some examples, Wally is consistently throughout all the books a bit more literary and, I guess, whimsical than Nora and Jim, and he quotes from poems several times. He references "Am I a man on human plane designed, or am I not, Matilda?" which is from W.S. Gilbert's comic poems. That's the Gilbert who was in Gilbert and Sullivan. All right. Well, he also quotes from a Henry Kendall poem, which is called "When Underneath the Dead Brown Grass." It's about hot weather. And it says, "Far better in the sod to lie with pasturing pig above than broil beneath the copper sky in sight of all I love." I actually like that because I hate the heat myself. And Jim doesn't cite any literature, but I think his headmaster from the school that he was at is having a bit of a joke, because Jim's won some school prizes that he's brought home with him, and one of them is a copy of Samuel Smiles' book, which is called Self-Help. That was a classic of Victorian, the era, not Victorian, the state. A classic of Victorian literature, published 1859. It's all about, being responsible and self-improving. And obviously, Jim has those characteristics in spades, so I can't help but think it's that his headmaster was having a little bit of a joke, or that Bruce is deliberately highlighting that aspect of his character. Also, Mr. Linton quotes from Henry Kendall as well, so you can see that Wally's values are in line with the Linton values. Mr. Linton references a poem about being really good at ploughing, which is called Jim the Splitter, about a jackaroo. All right. And there's another point where, just before Mr. Linton goes off into the bush and gets lost, well, doesn't get lost, he falls off his horse and then the horse comes back and they can't find him. Just before that happens, Nora's saying, "Oh, do be careful because you're going out on a, not fully trained horse." And Mr. Linton says, "Sure, I'll be fine." He says, "You sound like the nervous young woman in Excelsior." And this is a reference to Henry Longfellow's poem Excelsior, which is about a young man who's warned not to climb a mountain, but does climb the mountain and then he dies. It was published in 1841. So that's actually a little bit of foreshadowing, because Mr. Linton's warned that his horse might, get a bit excitable because it wasn't properly trained, and then it does, and he falls off and he injures himself. So there you go. So although Bruce, at an overt level in the text, is sort of mocking literary pretentiousness, when you read it closely, there's actually quite a few. There's an assumption that the readers will be familiar with several of these artists that she's referring to, and she does illuminate their character by looking at what they like. So the Lintons and Wally like light-hearted poetry about Australian life. They do not like elaborate, romantic escapism. Mates of Billabong, I've got this 1970s edition, and this 1925 edition, or at least an edition which is inscribed in 1925, and this is what the 20s covers look like. So none of the editions that I have come with the modern warnings that are put on Bruce's works. The modern warnings say, some of Bruce's earlier works are considered to have had offensive and dated content, particularly in regards to racial stereotypes of Australian Aborigines, Chinese and Irish immigrants, and her earlier belief in the theory of social Darwinism. More recent reprints of the Billabong series have been edited to remove controversial material. So there is controversial material. When they're describing Billy, the Aboriginal stockworker, they call him the dusky retainer. I mean, why? Why add these adjectives? And his smile is described as a slit in a coconut. I just find all of that quite baffling, and I think it's possible to edit it out without affecting the text in any way, in any meaningful way. But I think that Billy does pose a problem for the series, because you can't edit him out altogether. Because if you did that, that would be to play into the worst possible, I guess, the original sin of Australia, which is to pretend that there was no one there when white settlers arrived. That it was terra nullius, that they arrived and there was no one there, they weren't using the land anyway, and they just moved on. So to remove Billy altogether would actually be to implicitly tell a lie. So you can't just turn him into another random white stockworker, because that would be, I think, more significant omission than to leave him there with his flaws. So complicated. Although that warning mentions Chinese, Irish and Aboriginal Australians, it doesn't mention Indian Australians, who are described in this book. I will say that Bruce depicts the housemaid as being ridiculous. She is nervous. She doesn't like the Indian. She instinctively mistrusts him. She describes him with the N-word. She says, "Gimme white Australia," in a sort of an ochre accent. And it's, I think, clear that Bruce is not endorsing that, because Nora, the point of view character, does not behave that way at all. She instinctively and generously responds to him as a human being. She perceives that he's a gentleman even though he's doesn't speak English. She manages to communicate with him. She provides him with saka. So although there is a whole lot of I guess descriptions of stereotypes of Indian hawkers, they are not endorsed by the text, and the characters that we like do not endorse that perspective. So again, race in Bruce, it's complicated. A summary. This is one of my favourites, if not possibly my all-time favourite of Bruce's works. It's well plotted, the characters are so clear, and when you look at it closely, she's using an awful lot of relatively sophisticated literary techniques to describe the characters to you. So she's using the chapter headers, she's using the illusions, the literary illusions that they themselves make, as well as the plot and what they're saying on the surface level. So, yeah, I think it's a complex, interesting, beautiful book. And you should totally read it.